Children are being coerced and extorted into recording themselves, hurting themselves and others for people on the internet. Now the FBI is saying that some of these people are part of a network called 764. So what is the 764 network? I'm Olivia Bennett. I'm a true crime journalist. Let's talk about it. I wanted to introduce Ben Popp. Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. Ben is joining us from the Anti-Defamation League. He's an investigative researcher. Ben, can you tell me a little bit about what you do?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm an investigative researcher with ADL's Center on Extremism. I specifically research white supremacist networks in the United States. So, COE as a whole looks at a broad range of extremist groups, all the way from left wing extremists and anarchists to what I do on the side of white supremacy. But yeah, I'm largely in that sort of right wing extremist space in terms of what I look at.
Okay, so we talked a little bit previously, and you mentioned that you've been studying 764 kind of in relation to some of these other groups that you've been looking at because of some sort of connections. Can you tell me a little bit about the origins of 764? According to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, I saw where it started in 2021. Does that sound about correct?
Yeah, that's about the time that it became active. It emerged out of something called the Com or the Community, which is just this sort of loosely organized network of extortionists, hackers, and other sort of cyber criminals. And 764 was sort of a subsect of that came out in 2021.
That makes sense. Can you tell me a little bit about how it functions? What they obviously target children, what they require them to do, what that works.
Yeah, so they sort of target children in a variety of ways. We see that they sort of use certain games as almost like hunting grounds for themselves. So we'll see things like Roblox or Minecraft. These games that are frequented by younger people are targeted as places where they'll look to bring younger kids in, and then from there, there's sort of this grooming process of bringing them into more private spaces where we actually do see other types of extremists congregating, so places like Telegram, which is an encrypted chat service, uh, as well as just kind of gaming adjacent spaces where they aren't necessarily friendly to extremists, but people can kind of get around certain moderation, places like Discord and that kind of thing. And so there's kind of all different ways that they'll look to exploit the kids that they're bringing in. So we see encouraging self harm, um, uh, encouraging just acts of violence, or like having these kids like carve the name of the person that brought them in into their skin, and sharing photographs of that, all the way to sort of like sexually exploitative material. So really nasty stuff that they're having these people that they're bringing in do.
So once these children are exploited, are they considered a part of the network?
So some might look to kind of continue the cycle of abuse. Uh, what's kind of very scary about this is we'll see uh, some of these people keeping things that they call lore books, which is essentially a collection of all of the materials they've gotten from a victim, and then they use that as leverage against the victim, as sort of blackmail, and that can encourage the victim to then continue the cycle of abuse on other people as well.
So one thing that I've kind of seen in my research is that often people will be extorted by this group, but then they'll be extorted into extorting other people. Would you say that many members of this group were first victims themselves?
It's hard to say, specifically since we don't, track them outright. The reason we sort of started looking at 764 is because of how adjacent they are to other extremist movements, specifically some sects of Satanist, white supremacist, accelerationist groups. So things like Order of Nine Angles, which is this very sort of freaky white supremacist group that involves like black magic and that kind of thing. Um, and accelerationism, I guess I should define, is this idea that society is on the sort of road to collapse, and so there's ways that extremists can then get in there and sort of accelerate the collapse of society, so that they can then build a new society in their image, whatever that is. So we see certain accelerationists just want something like a white ethno state, whereas others kind of have like darker ideas. Although obviously a white ethnostate is a very dark idea as well. But yeah, Order of Nine Angles, Temple of Blood, these kind of uh, uh, violent accelerationist sort of black magic cults, you could call it. Um, that's kind of typically what they believe in. So there's some overlap. Like we'll see, uh, some of the 764 stuff come up in the same spaces as this other stuff. So things like shared memes, shared kind of language, and that kind of thing. So there's a little bit of overlap, but 764 itself isn't accelerationist, and it's not really ideological either. It's more kind of like violence and exploitation for the sake of it to gain clout, but then also um, they're unfortunately just like enjoying what they're doing as well.
So I think it's interesting that you bring up the word cult in reference to some of these other groups that are somewhat associated with 764. I am curious, just because 764, it does target children, people insecure, and it gives them a place where it's almost sort of a community. Do you feel like this functions similarly to a cult, and would you say it would maybe qualify as a cult?
I mean, I'm definitely not an expert on cults, but I think that um, you could see similarities in this idea of having uh, blackmail material, other ways that they can sort of coerce people into doing what they want, continuing cycles of abuse, bringing other people in. So it has a lot of similarities in that aspect, but then obviously it's all done sort of over the internet and oftentimes anonymously as well. So uh, that's sort of the very strange part of it, is this is almost like a new frontier in how things like this can behave, rather than the traditional idea of like cults being in person and gathering at certain places and having compounds and that kind of thing. Now the compound is a internet space.
So what ideas kind of propel the 764 group? I know you mentioned that it's mainly just centered around violence and pain. What ideas really make this community?
Yeah, really just looking to cause uh, abuse, cause pain, as you said, and um, uh, yeah, violence for violence sake, really. Um, as I said, it's really non-ideological, but it does overlap with white supremacists and other kinds of extremists. So, looking back at the Antioch school shooter from several months ago, that individual had been sharing 764 memes, and there was some 764 stuff in their manifesto. But then, we also saw with materials from white supremacist groups being shared by this person as well. So. Um, all of these sort of uh, things overlap, as I said, and then there's this almost broader problem of just uh, younger people in particular being desensitized to violence and being almost like interested in violence. So there's some platforms that we're looking at that a lot of these individuals inhabit as well, outside of the ones that I've mentioned that are a little bit more dark, like a platform called Watch People Die, which is literally what it sounds like, a space where people share videos of people dying and other just extreme acts of violence against people and animals and pretty much everything horrible you can imagine. Um, and so, people who are in those spaces and interested in violence can uh, unfortunately be radicalized into this kind of thing.
Are there any other platforms where this extreme violence lives?
So yeah, the ones I mentioned before, Telegram, the encrypted chat service, we see these individuals using that platform. Discord, although Discord has been traditionally very good about monitoring for this kind of thing and uh, countering this on their platform. But pretty much any gaming adjacent space, platforms like Steam as well, which is the world's largest gaming platform, we see that as like a recruitment ground as well. But yeah, usually the sort of like really violent stuff is shared in these private spaces where people are brought in after they're kind of groomed and found on these like more mainstream gaming platforms.
So I know that specifically law enforcement investigation isn't necessarily your expertise, but in your research and in some of your history looking into hate groups like these, especially where they live online, The growing use of encryption. Do you think that poses a threat to these potential investigations?
It's certainly a challenge, but I think we've seen time and time again that you know law enforcement has been up to that challenge. Just with 764, since 2021, we've seen that there have been several arrests related to the network. Unfortunately, sometimes it's after the abuse has happened for a while, but law enforcement is able to counteract networks like this. Um, More broadly speaking, uh, I would say it's less about the actual encryption and that kind of thing, and more just about like the volume of content that poses a challenge. We've seen mass shooters occasionally talking about their activities before it happens, and that's not necessarily that not being caught is not necessarily a failure of the platform being inaccessible, but just because there's so many spaces to monitor and so many people talking in these spaces, it's often a challenge to catch that stuff. But we're seeing technology really catch up to that as well. Um, Ways of this kind of stuff being monitored automatically by artificial intelligence and that kind of thing.
So, how does the 764 network work? Are there several smaller pods, several smaller groups, spit-offs? Is it a larger network where people share this violent content? How do they connect?
Yeah, so as I kind of mentioned before, it's sort of a subsect of this broader the com or the community. Um, Another researcher described it as sort of the cool kid table in the cafeteria of that broader network. And so that's how I would view it. Is it's not necessarily like a group, but more just this loosely organized network that people um, want to be a part of, who are unfortunately interested in this kind of thing.
I do want to talk about some of the intimidation tactics used, swatting. It's been very closely tied to 764. Can you explain what that is for me?
Yeah, so swatting is just the idea of faking an emergency. We've seen tons of different ways that can be done, but faking an emergency to elicit a law enforcement response. Usually, they want a very strong law enforcement response. Um, Oftentimes, people that are swatting, they want to have sort of visual confirmation of what they do as well. So we've seen this used against popular internet personalities when they're streaming, because people want to see the cops come to that person's house while they're streaming, all the way to houses of worship being targeted, um, because they have something like a live stream going to so that people can kind of remotely join in. We've seen those be targeted as well, or just general spaces that have some sort of live feed as well. Certain streets have live feeds available, restaurants, anything you could think of really. And so yeah, this swatting is almost like entertainment for these people, but then usually it's not ideological. But we've seen sometimes how it can be, where it's specifically anti-Semitic people targeting Jewish houses of worship, or that kind of thing. So that's loosely what we see with swatting.
So, in terms of intimidation, we've talked about swatting. We've talked about blackmail, collecting lore books of people. Are there any other significant intimidation techniques that are being used by this online group?
Another technique that we'll see occasionally being used, not just by 764, but by a lot of extremists and non-extremists alike on the internet, is doxing. So this is just getting personal information from someone and sharing that, or threatening to share that. And so, we'll see that used a lot as a way to either intimidate or coerce or blackmail someone. So, that paired with the other things can be very problematic as well. So if a person has uh, a bunch of abusive material depicting a person, and then they also have that person's personal information, they can threaten to share it with people that that person knows, or they can just threaten to release that person's personal information on the internet.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a specific example of swatting, of false threats being called into a sheriff's office in Palm Beach County. This happened on August 16th, 2024. It's a 1 minute, 6 second phone call. I'm going to play the whole thing for you so that you can listen to it.
Hello? I am going to blow you up.
Hello, Sheriff's Office.
Hello?
Sir,
I am going to blow you up.
what are you going to blow up?
You, the police. I've got boom. Boom.
Where are you, sir?
I am at Palm Beach County Sheriff.
What is the
I am
address
going
where
to
you
blow
are?
you. I am going to blow you.
What
It's got
address are you
30
calling
minutes.
from, sir?
Got 30 minutes.
What address?
The call was traced back to Curtis Hodge in Louisville, Kentucky, which is over 1,000 miles away from where Palm Beach County is. Now, Curtis Hodge, according to court documents, was actually a part of the 764 group. He was also tied to a white supremacist group, and he was previously kicked out of a Job Corps program that he was in for welding swastikas. So what I think is interesting about this is the connection, like we've been talking about throughout this entire interview, between 764 and other hate groups. Can you define what a hate group is for me, and then tell me whether or not 764 necessarily fits into that definition?
Yeah, so at COE, we don't typically use the term hate group. That's not something that I normally use. Instead, I like to define things along the lines of extremist or non-extremist. And so uh, the sort of loose definition of extremism is this ideology, you know, drastically outside of what is normal, what is common, and then beyond that, does this ideology advocate for uh, sort of dismantling of institutions that are normal as well? So does it call for end to democracy? Is it looking to bypass democratic means to gain power? That kind of thing. So there's the sort of uh, ideology piece of it, and then also the more action-oriented piece. Use of violence would be another example of you know how we could define something as extremist. Does it call for the use of violence? Um, and so I think by that definition, it's hard to label something like 764 because, as I said, the sort of unified ideology isn't there. A lot of the groups I look at have very um, defined ideologies. It's very easy to look at them and say, okay, this group is primarily anti-Semitic. Here's what they believe about Jewish people, um, or this group's neo-Nazi because they often use swastikas or some other kind of symbol that is associated with the neo-Nazi movement. They venerate Hitler or something like that. So usually groups are very easily definable in that sense. Whereas this is much more difficult because it's a loosely organized network. People within it believe a broad range of things, and they're sort of just unified by this desire for exploiting people and committing acts of violence, either themselves or having other people commit acts of self harm. And so um, yeah, I would say it's not really clear. Is this an extremist movement? Um, I mean, what we can say is certainly it's outside of the norm in terms of what they believe and how they want to enact what they want to see in the world. So swatting, abuse, all of this is obviously very much outside of what's normal. But that unified ideology isn't there, so it just makes it a little bit more difficult to pin down. But as I said, it does overlap with a lot of very clearly white supremacist groups, and it draws inspiration from those as well, like Order of Nine Angles.
So just kind of to sum this up, in your experience, researching extremist groups, researching some of the groups that branch off of them, can they be dismantled?
Uh, Usually they will fall apart on their own. Um, what we've seen time and time again is a lot of extremist groups and movements suffer from infighting, suffer from individuals wanting to be in charge, and other individuals not wanting that person to be in charge, and so we see they'll split. They lose membership because multiple people are split between several groups now. So usually they kind of do that themselves, I would say, or just things sort of move on beyond them. We see how certain types of extremism are a little bit more trendy, I guess I would say, than others. So we see a lot less of the violent skinhead groups now than we did in, say, like the 90s, because that's not necessarily an in vogue form of extremism. Whereas this sort of stuff that is much more internet based, younger people, we're seeing a lot more of that now. I would say, yeah, as I said, they sort of usually dismantle themselves. But we also have seen how, law enforcement response can cause a lot of problems for white supremacist groups as well. Both violent white supremacist groups as well as non-violent white supremacist groups. When law enforcement does step in, it always makes it more challenging for these groups to organize.
Okay, Ben, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for your insight. I appreciate you for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to check out WatchTrueBlue.com for more true crime programming. You can also watch for true crime updates on Crime with Olivia on all platforms. Stay safe.